So just a word about this topic. This is a topic that has been a topic of discussion in this group for a very long time. We've had discussion with EPA and our 5 federal government agencies via our standing committee. And in 2015, we actually prepared some protocols that looked at ways that you could merge restoration and remediation more closely, where that would work. So 2020 has seen, as a result of our 2020 symposium, the preparation moving forward on some of these frameworks was a very high priority. And 2020 has seen 2020 and 2021 have seen tremendous progress in all these 3 areas of best practice framework. So we're very excited to share this with a larger audience. So I think people could come down. And I wanted to just introduce Jean. Jean is senior counsel at BP. I think a lot of you know her. She has been really she's had a lot of different responsibilities, but some of her primary recent work has to do with the Deepwater Horizon. She has been the key attorney involved in that whole activity. And a lot of her experience comes from that, but a lot of other experience related to both hazardous waste sites as well as oil spills. And BP, its predecessors, ARCO, have been members of the ad hoc group for more decades, I think actually since the beginning. So I would say that BP and its predecessors have been involved in the group since its beginning. ARCO was one of the founding members. So I don't have time, but I did want to tell people that we do have a database of cases that is natural resource damage cases under Superfund, Clean Water Act, et cetera, et cetera. NOAA does a fabulous job with this as well. Scott shaking his head. But some of those statistics are very, very interesting, and be glad to share that maybe after the fact if people are interested. So with that, on the timing generally of this panel, we have until 3:30 when we'll take a 15-minute break. We were assuming that Jean, you would lead this off for up to 15 minutes and then go into Steve Jones's presentation, which will be up to 30 minutes, and then throw it over to the panelists. And I think you were going to meet over some drinks. I don't know if you ever got to do that, but anyway, we look forward to hearing what all of you have to say. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Barbara, can you just let us know,
You have to speak into this.
do we have our remote speakers available?
Yeah,
Yes.
So Dave Charters is on. Wave, Dave, everyone can see you. And Rebecca's trying to get on. So I'm working with her real time.
Perfect.
Okay, this actually works better. So,
Okay.
For the video, for the Zoom.
Terrific. Thank you.
Rebecca is on. Good.
You're both okay. Excellent. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to see everybody in person as well as to see folks virtually. It's been a long time since we were able to get together face to face, and it's really wonderful to have a chance to talk to folks again and to exchange ideas face to face. I agree with some of the previous panelists. We share a lot more information when we're face to face and we have a chance to talk to each other and look each other in the eye and exchange ideas freely. So this panel is going to talk about opportunities and challenges in coordinating remedy and restoration activities at every stage of the process, from the RIFS to the remedy selection and remedy design and construction phase, and all of the natural resource damage assessment and restoration activities that can mesh with that. The end goal being to try to complete remedy and restoration projects sooner, potentially at a much lower cost than we would if we allowed remedy and restoration to proceed on several tracks. The The goal of today's panel is to spend some time exploring the benefits of coordinating remedy and restoration, looking for ways to help the parties find common ground on coordination, and also to talk a little bit about the challenges and potential obstacles to doing that, and potentially situations where you might not want to do it because it wouldn't work or it wouldn't be worth your time and effort. So we have 6 people today with extensive experience in coordinating this type of work, and I am really delighted to introduce you to them now. I'm going to start at the end of the table with Tony. Tony Penn, he is the chief of NOAA's Assessment and Restoration Division and the co-lead of NOAA's Damage Assessment, Remediation, and Restoration Program. He leads a nationwide group of professionals, including scientists and economists, who evaluate coastal habitats and resources injured by hazardous waste releases, oil spills, and vessel groundings. Tony's been with NOAA working on natural resource damage assessment issues since 1997. He was previously the Deputy Division Chief of the Assessment and Restoration Division for 8 years, and prior to that, manager of NOAA's assessment and restoration work in the Southeast region, where he worked directly with scientists and economists to address coastal pollution and related physical impacts from waste sites, oil spills, and vessel groundings. Tony began his career as a natural resource economist, conducting damage assessment work primarily in the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean regions, with a focus on restoration scaling, habitat equivalency analysis, and recreational impact assessment. He has a BS in economics from the University of Wisconsin and a master's in agricultural and resource economics from the University of Maryland. And because I have worked with Tony for many, many years, I have to say he has an extraordinary, unbelievable wealth of experience, both in restoration and in coordinating it with remedy. So we are extremely fortunate that Tony was able to join us today. We have another tribal. We're glad he's here. We have another trustee representative on the phone, and I want to introduce Rebecca Stevens right now. Rebecca is joining us virtually today from Idaho, where she is a program manager for the Coeur d'Alene Tribe's Lake Management Department, its hazardous waste program, and she's also the restoration coordinator for the tribe and the trustee group. She has been working on water quality related issues for over 15 years. She's the co-author of the Coeur d'Alene Lake Management Plan, and she represents the tribe in the Bunker Hill Mining and Metallurgical Complex Superfund site. So as a result of her work, she has extensive experience in working with EPA to implement a remedy for the Coeur d'Alene Basin, and also in working with EPA and the other trustees to coordinate remedy efforts with restoration work. Rebecca is the tribe's technical representative on the Restoration Partnership, and she is integrally involved in using NRD settlement funds to conduct restoration work and to coordinate it with remediation work. So we are delighted that Rebecca could join us today and could share her experiences with us. She has some fascinating remarks to share. I am also going to introduce our other remote speaker right now. Dr. David Charters is the Superfund Eco Risk Program Manager for US EPA. He's in the Office of Superfund Remediation and Technology Innovation, and he's also the Eco Risk Science Advisor to the Assistant Administrator of the Office of Land and Emergency Management, that's OLEM, at US EPA. He responds to chemical incidents, he helps evaluate and remediate those incidents, and he works on national policy work groups for both of those previous groups, OSRTI and OLEM, and is its project officer for the interagency agreements with some of the natural resource trustees. Dr. Charters is also the author of the Superfund Ecological Risk Assessment Guidance for Superfund, so he has some very interesting thoughts on that topic. And he's the Quality Assurance Manager for the Office of Superfund Remediation and Technology Innovation. He oversees the quality program for the environmental response team and the National Superfund Remedial Program and the contract laboratory program. And he received his bachelor's from Syracuse University and his PhD from Binghamton University. And we are very fortunate he could join us today virtually. And we are looking forward to getting some comments from him on EPA's perspective on both opportunities and challenges for coordinating remedy and restoration. I'm going to move to our other three panelists. Jeff Martin, sitting right here, is a partner at Hutton, Andrews and Kurth. He has over 40 years of experience in environmental law and litigation under all of the major environmental statutes, CERCLA, RCRA, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, TSCA. And his practice is focused on complex multi-party environmental cases since he first began. He drafted the original version, I think that means the model version, of the agreements that are widely used today in CERCLA proceedings. And he has represented companies in more than 100 federal and state Superfund cases. His first chair litigator, who's also mediated environmental disputes, served as a mediator himself, and his deep experience across so many cases makes him a nationally recognized figure in Superfund and natural resource damages and toxic tort litigation. So Jeff represents waste management firms, electric utilities, consumer product manufacturers, chemical companies, and paper companies, and he will be giving us a perspective on the industry point of view in coordinating remedy and restoration. Jeff also was an editor of the very first Harvard Environmental Law Review. He clerked for U.S. Judge John Pratt in 1978. He's been in private practice since 1979 and has litigated cases in both trial and appellate courts across the United States and Puerto Rico. He has a massive amount of practical experience with NRD and remedy claims, which he is here to share with us today. Immediately next to me, we have Dr. Cass Bridges. She works in Chevron's Technical Center as an environmental subject matter expert, where her role is to find solutions to complex environmental problems, looking for win-win solutions for nature, communities, and business. She represents Chevron on the World Business Council for Sustainable Development's Nature Positive and Natural Climate Solutions work streams, and also IPCA's Nature Positive Task Force. Before starting at Chevron and earning her doctorate, Cass worked with various Native American tribes in Oklahoma to study and protect natural resources within their jurisdiction from both agricultural and mining waste. She has extensive experience with Questa mine site, as well as other complex Superfund sites. And she will also be sharing her views of both the PRP and the industry perspective on how we could coordinate remedy and restoration effectively and what we should be thinking about in that process, as well as the type of factors that motivate corporate PRPs, like her employer, like my employer, to enter into these types of collaborative projects. Finally, we have Dr. Steve Jones, a population and community ecologist with over 30 years of experience in the consulting industry. He specializes in natural resource damage assessment, ecological risk assessment, habitat creation, enhancement, and restoration, qualitative and quantitative functional assessments of terrestrial and wetland habitats, and biostatistics. He has extensive experience designing and implementing ecological studies for a wide diversity of ecosystems throughout North America. And his experience includes evaluating the impacts of remedy actions on eco-resources and incorporating compensatory restoration into remedy designs. Dr. Jones received his BS in biology from Tulane University, his master's in environmental sciences from Texas Christian University, and his PhD in ecology from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. He is a member of the Society of Toxicology and Environmental Chemistry and the Ecological Society of America, and a certified senior ecologist. And he was deeply involved in drafting the framework that we're going to talk about today. He has been an integral part of helping the ad hoc group understand where there might be the best opportunities to coordinate remedy and restoration, when it might make the most sense to do so, might be the most beneficial for all parties concerned, and also in thinking about the obstacles to coordination when it doesn't make sense, and when you might not want to do it. So next, Dr. Jones is going to present the proposed framework, and he's going to give us his advice on some best practices for coordinating remedy and restoration where it makes sense.
Before Steve begins, I wanted to make one tiny comment that I had meant to say, and that is that do not view this agenda to be in two parts, which is, pie in the sky, high level to in the trenches, because many of the themes that we have discussed so far, this is like building blocks, because a lot of the things that we've talked about in terms of efficiency, progress, collaboration, et cetera, are very relevant to these frameworks as well. So I just wanted to point that out. Ted had mentioned this at lunch. I promised him I would say something and I forgot. So with that. It's all yours.
Okay, am I coming across loud and clear? Well, until the day that I didn't realize that Tom Brady and I had one thing in common. So we both came out of retirement for one last shot at glory. Okay, with that, Gene and Barbara gave a very good introduction, so I'm just going to jump right in. For the background, these are the issues that our working group, the affiliates, the member companies, as well as some outside reviewers had given us feedback on and coming up with this. But natural resource damage assessments are typically regarded as a residual process after remediation has been completed. CERCLA has regimes for both remediation and NRDA. These are the Federal Register documents. And the two regimes usually proceed on different tracks and timelines. Again, this has been experienced over the years that we've noticed. CERCLA, however, does require consideration of natural resources and has a consideration of may they be injured is due to a release. Well, as part of the evaluation of the alternatives in the feasibility study, that there's an opportunity for net environmental benefits, that is, each of the alternatives should be evaluated in terms of its impacts on existing resources and the benefits of any remedial options that are evaluated. Statutes, regulations, and guidance are largely separate processes of remediation / primary restoration and NRDA and compensatory restoration. The opportunities to coordinate remediation and restoration are infrequently considered by potentially responsible parties and trustees during the feasibility study and remedial design. Now, this is not to say that it doesn't occur. It doesn't occur on a consistent basis, and that's one thing that we're proposing to do, because there are examples to where it has been part of the process and in more cases than not, it has not been part of the entire process. And what we're looking to is to integrate those for increased efficiency and speed of remediation and achieving compensatory restoration. In practice, and this is primarily on the PRP parts and the practitioner's parts, that the CERCLA process is compartmentalized. On the RI, you typically have the scientists doing the site investigation, site characterization work. Once that is done, it's handed over to the engineering side for the remedial design and implementation of the remedial actions. Now, I hope I don't offend any engineers that may be sitting in the room, but they have different mindsets between the scientists and the engineers. That, as I describe it, in science, our world is a little bit black, a little bit white, and a whole bunch of gray. Whereas in the engineering side, kind of the black and white come a lot closer together. So I apologize for anybody I may have offended with that one. A large number of the over 1,000 damage claims have taken many years to reach settlement, in some cases decades. Now, I probably should have prefaced by saying that most of this talk in the development is based on the CERCLA process, but it's also applicable to other federal and state programs as well. And many of those settlements could have proceeded more effectively and expeditiously had remediation and restoration been considered from the very start. Potential benefits of the framework, as our group has developed it. Is there any way to get rid of this blocking some of the. Sorry about that. Yeah, there you go.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that helps. Again, we're looking for early identification. Injury to natural resources, are they significant enough to warrant the time and the cost for an NRDA? The opportunities for enhanced primary restoration and on-site compensatory restoration can be identified early in the process, as well as data needs for assessment of injuries, service losses, and restoration. The expedited remediation, restoration, and compensation can be completed at a reduced timeline and increased cost efficiency through early identification. We're also looking for consistency among stakeholder groups and also consistency in coordinating remediation and natural resource restoration at sites nationwide. And I can speak from experience, having worked in several districts throughout the United States, but all negotiations have not been consistent throughout. In some cases, we've been greeted with open arms, well, let's work together. In other cases, that it's a new concept to them and they, are kind of afraid to go where they haven't been before. Overview of the framework. I'm going to go through a brief overview and then walk through the framework itself. The integration of restoration, compensatory restoration through NRDA, or injury through all phases of the site characterization, remedial design, and implementation of remedial action. Let's get going from the get-go. Engagement of NRD specialists in all phases, including ecologists. Of course, being an ecologist myself, that's why I put that number one. Economists, don't want to forget those folks either, and other natural resource specialists as driven by the data. Let's follow the data, let's follow the science. Consideration of data needs for NRDA and settlement opportunities at each phase of the process. And concurrent implementation of remedial action and restoration. That is, you have the yellow iron, as our engineers call it, out on the site. Why not accomplish it all at once rather than at different points in time, if possible? And also the framework incorporates many decision points for a no-go decision on whether to proceed with either a cooperative assessment or coordinating remediation and restoration. I want to walk through the framework now, and this is taken from a document that should be posted on the symposium website. So it goes through the remedial investigation, the feasibility study, the record of decision, the remedial design, and the remedial action. We have it set up to where the different columns are the investigation or remedial phase, the action by the PRP and or the trustees for NRDA restoration and evaluation of the data, the settlement opportunity at that point in the process, and the final column on the right side is for the comments. And the tier 1 remedial investigation typically includes the screening level ecological risk assessment. And also under the trustees action, we try to put what is required by the trustees in an NRDA evaluation, the pre-assessment phase, the injury assessment, selection of restoration alternatives, and so on. At this phase, with a well-designed tier 1 site investigation, we should be able to collect sufficient data to make a determination whether a NRD is likely or not. And if it is likely, and again, you should be able to know at this point, because if you have some screaming high chemical concentration, a very important resource, then the chances are that the NRD will probably proceed. And if there is a likelihood to proceed, this would be a time to initiate an MOA. I've been involved with a project where the MOA comes very late in the process, and that really stalls the process down. So if the MOA can be executed early on in the circle process, that goes a long way toward coordinating the remediation and restoration. In the tier 2 remedial investigation, this is typically where the baseline risk assessments are done. at least every project I've been involved with, there's additional data collection for the risk assessments, both the ecological and the human health at this point in the process. This would involve a work plan for the tier 2, which is given to EPA for their review and approval, but it could also incorporate the assessment plans on the part of the trustees to keep it with their requirements for an NRD. At this point, that we determined that the possibility for a settlement is moderate to high. At this point, we should know or have a good idea an NRD is possible, but it's also a major decision point. And I think one of the themes that I heard throughout today is the companies, the corporations buy into the process of moving things along and protecting natural resources. Now, in some cases, a PRP or a PRP group may decide, well, it's not worth the time and the effort for us, or we just don't want to collect data that goes above and beyond that would be required for a risk assessment, because the standard for risk and injury are quite different. You know, they are not the same. So do you do what EPA would like you to do, or is proving you to do for the tier 2 remedial investigation? Or you go a step or two beyond and get data that actually goes more toward identifying injury and loss of resources. Once the BARA is completed at this point, that any data collected going forward is primarily for the injury assessment and or the damage claim. The feasibility study, we see that as a very important phase too, that the coordination does not stop here, or ideally does not begin here. That it's an opportunity in the feasibility study investigation to collect additional injury data for an injury assessment. It also is the place where a net environmental benefits analysis should be executed in reviewing each of the remedial alternatives that are being considered. And I think one of the things that I heard the term blue a lot today, which, you know, there's, you know, the blue carbon in a lot of coastal marshes, for example. This would be an opportunity to evaluate the remedial alternatives. Are you remediating only that really absolutely has to be necessary, or are you over remediating and possibly losing some of the services provided that don't need to be cleaned up, you know, ideally, because again, the risk assessments are very conservative typically, whereas an injury assessment, you really have to get to the meat of it, but it still have to meet EPA's requirements for protection of human health and the environment. So we're not discounting that at all. At this point, that the settlement opportunity is moderate to high, but it's also important that ecologists and NRD specialists should be part of an FS team. One of the very first projects that I worked on under the Superfund, that the first cut of the remedial design had riprap in the stream channel and crown vetch along the floodplain. And we can do better than that. The record of decision, at this point, the remedy has been selected, but it's also a major decision point on whether to proceed to coordinate remediation and restoration. In the remedial design, you know, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road in restoration. That there's again another opportunity with a pre-design investigation to collect additional data that can go into the injury assessment. The remedial design itself progresses from a 30% to 60% to 90% to a final design. At this point, that not only can you collect data for the injury assessment, also for the restoration. For example, if you're working in an aquatic system, what about the hydrology? What types of substrates are you looking at that might support your final goal and what you're looking for? The restoration features can be included in the design. That one of my last projects earlier this year, the final remedial design went in, and that included the primary restoration that was actually enhanced restoration that were previously had existed. And throughout the process, the details can progress from going to a conceptual plan to actually a final plan. And when we get to the remedial action, that there's not much left to do, but if there's an NRD, it makes it very, very difficult at this point to collect data for an injury assessment. Because if you've gone out, you've put on a cap, you've excavated, impossible to get additional data that you might need for an injury assessment. So you're going to have to rely on what's been in the RIFS or other secondary or historical data sources. At this point, also, the damages and the settlement costs are likely to be much higher. You're looking at off-site, which may require years to find appropriate sites, to negotiate access, to develop plans, to mob and remob for the actual compensatory restoration. It can still be done, but it's much, much more difficult at this point. And this is a table that Jeff put together that he might talk about later. And this is the factors that are favoring coordination versus the separation of a remedy and restoration. On the left side, factors weighing in favor of coordination. The PRP is likely, or PRP liability is clear or likely. A release has caused obvious injury to natural resources. The injury is significant enough to warrant the time and cost of conducting an NRD assessment. Coordination can save time and money. Remedy and restoration data will be collected from the same or similar areas. Potential remedy alternatives likely to be evaluated include work that can create or improve habitat, and that's what I call enhanced primary restoration. Factors weighing in favor of separating remediation and restoration. PRPs have good faith defenses to liability. The release does not appear to have caused significant injury to natural resources. Injury is slight, transitory, or unrelated to substances associated with some or all of the PRPs. Little or no similarity in sampling locations or schedule. Restoration is needed in a different location unrelated to the remedy. I'm going to add one more too, that on large sites that have multiple operating units, that the last thing you really want to do is create attractive nuisance, as we call it. Like, will an enhanced restoration in a very small portion of a much larger system attract resources that may be injured as opposed to more of a pristine area to where you don't have that problem. Now, Barbara had mentioned that there's a database of projects or remediation and restoration have been reported and case history stood up. And the thing that's interesting is Scott had talked about the diamond alkali site. So maybe you can shed some light on this one. But we put this into the same framework that we did for the other tables that I showed. But our write-up indicates that there was a pre-site assessment agreement to do a cooperative NRD. There was a 1-year milestone period with agreement to extend that period if certain conditions were met. And to make it, kind of cut to the chase, the coordination was not achieved because the PRPs identified some restoration projects, but the trustees did not accept those as a viable projects for NRD compensation. So in this case, the attempt to coordinate the remediation and restoration was unsuccessful from what Scott had indicated, that eventually there was some compensation identified that was appropriate. Did I get that more or less right? Okay. Now, another one's a little easier. The Dan River Steam Station site in North Carolina is another project in our database. Is that from the get-go, from the screening level risk assessment and the tier 1 RI, that the PRP, state and federal trustees all were involved in evaluating remediation and restoration activities. This continued throughout the entire process, and in the remedial design, there was actually a restoration project that was identified as appropriate for compensation. That was the Pig River Dam project. Now, in our kind of pre-talks, that there will probably be some other projects identified during the question and answer period. So in summary, the framework is consistent with consistent regimes for remediation under both EPA and NRD in the Federal Register. The framework expedites remediation, restoration, and compensation at a reduced timeline and increased cost efficiency. The framework provides for early identification of the likelihood of an NRD claim and opportunities for enhanced primary and on-site compensatory restoration. The framework engages natural resource specialists in all phases of site investigation, remedial design, and remediation. And although based on CERCLA, the framework can be applied to other federal and state programs. And that is the end of the walk through the framework. The questions can answer any during the next part of this the session.
Okay, thanks, Steve. What we are going to do next is use a question and answer format to ask our panelists to comment on their experience in coordinating remedy and restoration. And they all have some prepared some questions, which they've seen in advance and have prepared answers to. And then we are going to open it up to the audience for questions. And if you don't have any, I have some additional questions. Some of them have heard the questions. Not all of them have heard the questions. So,
Jean, if I may interject, just a quick note to Dave and Rebecca that are remote, that when they're speaking, if they can unmute, there's a conflict between the mics in the room and the mics on Zoom. So if they're speaking, we can't speak here. So if we're speaking here, if they can just mute their mics, that would be great. We figured out what the issue was from this morning.
oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Okay. I'm going to start by asking Tony to share a few remarks about his experience in coordinating remedy and restoration. You've worked on an awful lot of cases, all kinds, all over the country. Tell us about your experience.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. Folks hear me? This is working all right. All right. Yes, let me just first say that I'm very much, I think Noah's very much supportive of the concept of coordinating remediation and restoration. I think we do have some good experience from practice. I've done a couple of those. And yeah, it just generally think that's much better. It is a way I think that we can achieve restoration, remediation more expeditiously and more cost effectively. So I just want to say I'm supportive. I think the cooperation or the coordination can take a variety of different forms. I think the framework does a great job of highlighting some very specific ways that we achieve better outcomes. I think there are some other things we can talk about that also we can take advantage of that will help us in this community of practice. But a couple experiences that I'll share, and I know we got a large panel here, so I'll try and keep my remarks brief, but that I saw that were beneficial and that took advantage of some of the ideas in the framework. First was one of the cases I worked on starting in 97, 98, going way back to the beginning. Unnamed case for the moment, unless there's real interest, but it was that integration of data collection early on. It wasn't, I won't say it was for the whole of the case, but for a piece of the case where there was need for information on fish consumption for the human health assessment for EPA. There was additional work done to add to that survey so that we could get information on lost use for purposes of no-direct fishing, lost uses for the damage assessment. I wasn't there at the time when that decision was made. I think that was largely driven by the PRP there, but I think it was very smart. And ultimately, I think we did some really good work with that survey information to really inform the lost use wreck fishing assessment there. So that, I think that is one of the key features that was highlighted here of coordinating that data collection. That was a nice example in that particular case. On the other end of the spectrum, it wasn't a case I was directly involved with, but I have heard about it through colleagues over the years. And that was a case where the remedy basically did that enhanced primary restoration, added some compensatory restoration. So there was the one-time mobilization to get all of the work in the field done. I think a challenge there was maybe the damage assessment wasn't ready at that point to quote unquote settle, but the PRP took the risk and said, no, this is a good opportunity. We're going to do it. And, in coordination with the trustees that, yes, we will get through the process. We'll go through the public review comment, But the work was done before all that had been done. So that is a challenge, but there's some real opportunities there. And I think there are ways to address that challenge if we all commit to doing the public review, doing the process, if in fact that is going to be something that the PRPs want before sort of putting shovels in the ground. But I'll stop there. Again, I'm a big supporter, and I think that we do have some good examples, and we can probe further how this works and how to overcome some of our challenges. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'm going to toss it to Rebecca next. Rebecca, tell us a little bit about your experiences in coordinating remedy and restoration with the Coeur d'Alene tribe and the Coeur d'Alene Basin site.
Sure. Hi, and good morning to some of us on the West Coast. Thank you so much, Jean, for the introduction, and thank you all. This is such a prestigious group. I'm honored to be with you. And Dr. Charters, I can't believe I've never met you yet. I consider you a professor. But we have a unique case. I think all cases are unique, but we've been successful in combining remedy with restoration, mostly based on the tribe's initiation of our NERDA claim in 1991, and with our federal trustees joining in 1995 to start collecting that irrefutable data that our tribal leaders guided us to collect, because we knew we would have to prove up injury in court. EPA was really focused on addressing the human health concerns surrounding the Bunker Hill site. And the tribe saw that the natural resources that were injured from the release of mine waste contamination had not been looked at very closely. And because of the tribe's connection with these resources, and as the original natural resource manager since time immemorial, it was really important for the tribe to address all those injuries with our federal trustees through an MOA. And we've actually had 3 since. So everything that's been discussed so far is tried and true, that's for sure. We do have a couple of projects. We've settled with all the mining companies, all of our NERDA claims, and EPA is also settled with their remedial needs. And it's been a long time coming. We're 27 years into it, working together, and with EPA utilizing our natural resource data that we collected in their RIFS process, that really helped kind of start the joint navigation under CERCLA for everyone to see that we needed to work hand in hand. EPA actually ended up, and I didn't mention this yesterday, Jean, but they utilized our data, specifically surface water and aquatic organisms data that were injured. They utilized that data and actually lowered their cleanup standard based on our findings. Some of you might have heard about the tundra swans that migrate through our basin, the way their feeding habits, how they burrow down into the sediment. They get direct contact with lead, arsenic, cadmium, and zinc, mostly lead and sediment. And so the cleanup standard was 700, and EPA used our data and lowered it to 530 parts per million for that ecological cleanup. So that was pretty important. The 2 projects that I'm thinking of where remedy and restoration are working hand in hand. One is a wetland project. It's actually an agricultural field that was converted. Well, it was a wetland that was converted into an agricultural field many years ago. And it's right in the floodplain of the Coeur d'Alene River, where recontamination potential is real and continues to happen. And it was identified as a restoration opportunity for us to do some cleanup work with EPA, as what that was already identified in their interim record of decision, but have them do the remedial work and then have us do the restoration work. Our teams are working together, a lot of players involved. Everything down to design, working with adjacent landowners, and helping everybody navigate through the process has been really profound. We've learned a lot of lessons. The project is just now in phase 1 of construction, where there will be on-site disposal of the contamination. Something I mentioned yesterday was that initially our state trustee with Idaho Fish and Game thought that they had kind of cleared their ARR compliance, or at least meeting the intent of that with our cultural resources, and something that the tribe had known and brought to the attention of both EPA and our other trustees, that This site was very significant to the Coeur d'Alenes, and they needed to do some more cultural resource assessment and investigation. And so they did that, and we're a little bit more satisfied moving forward, but just having the tribe's finger on the pulse on these projects and the knowledge that our tribal leaders have brought to the table through the Superfund process as well as the NERDA process has proved beneficial. And then I might save my other example for later on. So with that, I'll pass it to one of our other panelists. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to turn to David. I think it would be really helpful for everyone on the panel and everybody in the room to hear EPA's perspective on coordinating remedy and restoration. And your experiences coordinating remedy and restoration. How easy is it? How difficult is it? Tell us what you think about these types of proposals.
EPA would love to coordinate natural resource issues into our remediation. There are a couple of challenges. We do the BIRA, the baseline ecological risk assessment, which is necessary but not sufficient for the natural resource damage assessment. We have to focus on ROD goals. We need to meet those. And here's where it gets interesting. If the trustees and the PRPs are trusting with verification, the coordination with EPA moves forward in an excellent fashion. If the trustees and the PRPs are not working and playing well together, we cannot mediate that. We have no authority to either order the PRPs to do work on natural resource damage and collecting information on that. And we certainly are not going to overrule the trustees. So if there is not a cooperative attitude going in, EPA gets put in a very difficult position. You need to order them to collect this. They're being silly. We shouldn't be able to have to collect this. They need to do A, we need to do B. It puts EPA in a very difficult position and the coordination goes south. Overall, generally on natural resource trustee sites, EPA is not included. While I tend to be in the situation of, I don't tend not to go to sites where everything's working well. I tend to go to sites where it's congratulations, you've become politically visible and we need to fix it. So I tend not to see the good news sites. I tend to see the bad news sites. And the bad news sites tend to be where the trustees and the responsible party community are not cooperating. We tend not to be positive in those lights, but if there's a coordination and communication, EPA is more than willing to be flexible to expedite different issues, but it falls to the trustee. We as EPA are actually pretty good that we're not trustees. We have not over the years had real interest in being trustees, with deference to BP on the oil spill. And as I'm sure BP knows, there was a particular reason we became a trustee to utilize different laws. But generally speaking, we think it is a wise move we not be a trustee. But at the same time, I think we can, with our experience in remediation and our coordination with tribes, states, other federals, that we can be an asset, but we can't fix a dysfunctional coordination situation. So we have no authority, but we're always willing to cooperate as best we can. And it's best when everybody is looking toward the same endpoint. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff next. I know Jeff has some thoughts on exactly the same topic, and I'd be really interested in hearing your perspective as somebody who has been representing industry for the last 40 years on both those sites where cooperation works because all the parties are playing together nicely and those sites where it doesn't work so well. So share a little more.
Thanks, Gene. Can you hear this mic on or not? Thank you, Tara. Just to give you a little background perspective from me. I mean, I have, as you heard in my introduction, which was too long and too flattering, but have worked on sites involving cleanups and natural resource damages for probably 40 years or so. And most of those sites involved garden variety cleanup claims and didn't involve natural resource damages. And that this is the case in the 80s and 90s for the most part. I assumed, as did most of my fellow attorneys and clients, that eventually there would be claims filed, but in a lot of those, the statute of limitations ran out. We never saw them. So one of my biases is to look first when I'm involved in a site to see whether or not we're likely to actually face an NRD claim, because there's no reason to get involved in the resource damage assessment phase if you think you're not going to face a claim. And as you heard from Steve, who referenced this table that I gather I had a hand in, although it was a while ago, for the framework document. There are instances where it makes sense, I think, for parties to look at engaging natural resource trustees and consultants early in the game, because you can save money in the long run by having the aggregate costs of a damage claim and remediation reduced if you do it right. There are a lot of cases where that doesn't happen. In my experience, and just looking at the table, it probably needs to be expanded a little bit from what we put together already. For example, it seems to me I would add to that list of cases where it's easier to coordinate remediation and restoration, sites which involve single PRPs or a predominant PRP. It's easy for them, if you have a client who knows what their long-term exposure is going to look like, to try to manage their risks early on by looking at both the potential resource damages they're facing and the remediation costs, and to think about ways to reduce both in the process. Similarly, if you have a common counsel involved who can represent the group, so you avoid conflicts of parties who are holdouts, you're more likely to coordinate on resource and restoration. Where you have experienced, as we do at this panel and in this room, experienced counsel and technical assistance, they're more likely to see the advantages. So getting consultants involved early in the game, I think, is good, even if you're not sure whether you're going to face a damage claim. Having interested and active trustees is key. There's a lot of personalities involved. Some trustees are easy to work with and some are not. And if you have experience knowing which is which and who you can work with effectively, I think you're well advised to explore remediation and cooperation in that context. And I think just looking at the big picture, most of the sites that involve sort of wetlands, rivers, oceans are fairly obvious candidates for coordinating the two, because the damages to resources are pretty obvious. And in today's environment, you're likely to face those claims. Where you're involved in, like a lot of the sites I was working on in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, waste disposal, recycling facilities, much less likely to face significant natural resource damage claims. So I would probably work on modifying this table a little bit before we recirculate it for the general consumption. I want to give you one example of a case that last year I settled after maybe 20 years of involvement, about how you can coordinate resource and natural resource damages, even in a context where you're not working maybe hand in glove with a set of trustees. It involved the Cotman Avenue site on the Delaware River in Philadelphia. And it was an unusual case in that we were actually litigating with the government, EPA, represented by Justice, in federal court over what the appropriate remedy for that site was. And my client group, I was the common counsel for the group. My client group was made up of electric utilities that took fairly progressive attitude toward managing their liabilities and looking ahead to deal with limiting their exposures. And they realized that the positions that the owner operators of this particular site, was a PCB transformer recycling facility, that the owners and operators were taking a position on remediation work that was pretty extreme and unlikely to be accepted by the court. We knew that if we were to align with EPA, we could effectively negotiate a bit on the remedy, but we could also look behind the scenes, and we had consultants retained to look behind the scenes at what the natural resource damages were. So in the course of coordinating with EPA on the remedy, we were behind the scenes looking at what the natural resource damage claims were that we might face after the court had made its decision on the remedy. We ultimately did win on the remedy issue. We picked the remedy that EPA and we wanted. But we looked at, in the course of that, a vegetative cover for the site that would restore some of the habitat. And we looked at minimizing the amount of excavation and damage that would be in the aquatic environment next to the site. So that when there was a resource damage claim that we knew we were negotiating over, and would be negotiating over the time, that the value of that claim would be significantly less with our remedy than what would be the case if we had lost. And we negotiated a remedy that we were able to tell EPA with our consultants and technical experts actually improve the quality of the environment from before the site was ever used for transformer recycling. So we could take the position credibly that our damages were in the 5-figure range, whereas EPA's damages were in the 8-figure range. And we wound up, this was a case where we didn't do a restoration project, we considered some, but we wound up settling at the end, and this is public now, for maybe 15% of what EPA was, and the trustees were looking for. So it's an example of where you can do good work in advocating for restoration in the context of what the remedy looks like, and also at the same time reduce your liability for resource damages. So I think my experience is, you first, when you get involved in a site like this, you need to do a little bit of triage. Are you in a situation where you are going to face a claim? How big is that claim likely to be? Do you have a group that's organized, that's funded, that can work together? And in the right context, as Table 1 shows, and as I think you heard from Steve, if you look at different points in the process, you can always sort of reevaluate whether or not you can change to move more toward cooperation as opposed to confrontation. If you work that way, you can, I think, reduce in the aggregate your remediation and restoration damage costs. So that's sort of my experience. Most of my cases, frankly, don't involve claims. Most will settle with small NRD payments. But there are other cases where I've been involved in where the damage claims are pretty much more significant. They're easier to work with if you got experienced experts like we have in this room, in this group, and clients like we have in this group that understand the risk of taking extreme positions. So that's my experience.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to turn to Cass next. You represent one of those large companies that is familiar with large cases where there actually is an awful lot of money at stake. And I know you have experience with some very complex sites, including the Questamine site. Be really interested in hearing about your thoughts on what motivates an industry representative like yours to want to coordinate remedy and restoration? And conversely, what might give you the incentive not to do it?
Thank you. Gene, I think the short answer is we technical folks start off by doing whatever the lawyers tell us to do. And that's a joke, but also not a joke at all. But I think for me, from a technical perspective, I think the draft framework lays it out really well when you repeatedly say that when you get the scientists together from both sides, so you have the human health and the eco risk assessors, along with the ecologists and the natural resource specialists, then you can have the most or the highest likelihood of a good collaborative outcome. And so I'm obviously biased in saying that because I am a scientist, but I think from a PRP standpoint, the most important thing I think is that understanding, like, if we can, if there's not as Jeff was saying, if there's not a clear idea that there is an injury to natural resources, then I think collaboration would be unlikely, but I don't want to kind of speak from the legal perspective there. And I think it's in instances where there is that possibility, like we've been saying on the panel, I think it makes perfect logical sense to do so. And one thing that I would like to mention that Scott from NOAA brought up was the influence that technology is having in helping us get to that understanding of whether there's actually been an injury faster. So we have amazing remote sensing capabilities now. We have had satellites up with multispectral sensors for almost 8 years now that are sort of continuously collecting this amazing data planet-wide that we can look at and understand very quickly. So in 10 years ago, you're sending people out to the field to do these surveys, and today with machine learning and AI and these fancy algorithms and this great data sets, we can understand a potential impact in a matter of hours by collecting the right kinds of data. And that not just with remote sensing, but also proximal sensing techniques on that screening level stage. We have huge advancements in the rapid screening technology where you can go out to the field and, like, your handheld guns are giving you much more accurate, predictable data on screening level type assessments of the situation. So I think getting to that, there's higher likelihood of collaboration by leveraging technology and data and bringing the scientists together early. I think I'll end there in the interests of letting my far more esteemed colleagues up here weigh in on some other questions.
Okay, let me turn it back to Tony then. Tony, what conditions do you think are needed at a site in order to effectively coordinate remedy and restoration?
Yeah, thank you.
That one that worked.
We're talking too much. Well, I guess I would echo some of what Jeff said to start. Single PRP, common council, good relationships. So I think it demonstrates the value of these kinds of meetings where we can talk outside of the heated debates of a case and get to know each other and establish some of those relationships. But I honestly, I think it comes down to, are those circumstances right? Has the timing worked out where, EPA has started its process, the trustees are aware and know of the site to some extent and can engage? Are the PRPs interested? For me, that is a huge determinant of whether or not we can, do some level of coordination with the remediation and the restoration. I'm like I said, I'm very much supportive. I think we've done it to a large extent, to different degrees. I think we could do more of it. And I think if the PRPs are really motivated to do it, I think that's a really key factor in my mind. And there are a lot of PRP folks and representatives here that might beg to disagree with me, but that seems to me a really key factor for making this work.
Turning back to Cass, because I know you have something to say on this issue. What are some of the potential benefits of using or coordinating remedy and restoration in a case?
Thank you for setting that up, Jean. So Jean and I had a chat about this earlier, and most of you probably knew Ann Wagner, my predecessor at Chevron. I kind of took the baton from her and managing the technical side of the NRD issue for Chevron, and very luckily, I've had very little to do from a technical standpoint with NRD for Chevron. But what I do on my day-to-day basis is a lot of remediation projects that are outside of the NERDA context. And so this is where we have a regulatory obligation or legal obligation to remediate. And there is the compliance side of things, and we work out what the cleanup level is and we clean it up. And what I'm seeing lately that's just been absolutely fascinating and honestly truly exciting, and I think will end up being a driver for collaboration in the NERDA space and remediation space, is this focus on biodiversity and nature. And so we've talked a lot about climate in this meeting today, and it just makes me so excited. I'm so happy that that is such a focus item. But I would urge this group to turn an eye to biodiversity as well. And so we're watching all of these emerging trends in the targets and metrics space. So the Science-Based Targets Network, the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures, the COP15, the Convention for Biological Diversity is happening in November, and hopefully the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will be adopted. And then we're going to have likely voluntary reporting on things that we commit to and metrics to do with nature. So reduced nutrient loading, reduced pesticides, protecting land, the 30 by 30 tie-in. And so all of these nature-related drivers for adding a restoration aspect where we don't have to. And so it's been just super interesting from a remediation perspective when people come to me internally. I do internal technical consulting essentially, and they say to me, how can we take this remediation project and turn it into something really special? Like, we want to add value here. And what would the incremental cost be to do that? And how much value can we get in terms of these metrics that are coming down the road? And as everyone in this room is aware, climate is a massive crisis, as is biodiversity. And so we see the biodiversity and nature track happening kind of parallel with climate, to where now we have next month the SEC final rule on climate reporting. I'm very probably certain similar thing is going to happen with nature-related performance for corporations. And so that is driving us going above and beyond compliance in many instances, especially with remediation sites where we tailor an in-state vision to specific biodiversity outcomes that we want to see. And I think that is something really, really important to consider in the NRD space too, as we watch these kind of emerging things on the horizon: environmental justice, climate, and biodiversity. So I'm hoping, I shouldn't say I'm hoping, the next big NRD thing that comes across my desk, that will definitely be a consideration whenever that may be. Fingers crossed, touch wood. Not too soon. But thanks, Jean.
Thank you. We heard a little bit about NOAA's interest in considering the potential for a changing climate in the future when Steve talked just before this panel. But I told Tony I was going to ask him this question, so here it comes. Does NOAA consider the potential for future changes in climate at a project site, both when it's thinking about potential injuries and when it's thinking about restoration project options and thinking about the pros and cons of trying to coordinate remedy and restoration work?
Thank you. Yes, that is a hard one. The short answer is yes. I mean, we have to account for what is happening in the environment so that we can best measure what the interim loss is, tied to the contamination, not to what's going on with a changing climate. So we have to do that both in the quantification of injuries and then thinking about what value comes from the restoration? What landscape is it going to be in? We don't want to put something into the environment that is not going to be there in a few years' time. So we have to be thoughtful about both on the injury side, quantifying losses, accounting for a changing baseline, and then accounting for what's the best, most effective restoration. So how do we do that? That is the hard question. On the injury quantification, I would say, we do the best we can with the data we have. I think we've heard today that our observations, our data are getting better. Still, probably a lot of uncertainty about, well, what's happening to this habitat or this species in 10 years' time when there might still be some impacts of contamination. We're trying to tease it out. But I am confident that we're getting better technologies and better data. But I think it will still be a challenge, as it always has been in NRDA, of getting the best data to inform quantification. On the restoration side, I think we may not have to be so quantitative. Certainly, as we're thinking about, well, what benefits are we getting from these projects that are offsetting the injury? We have to say something about how long this project is going to be there, what species benefit, amount of habitat, et cetera. So there is a quantitative element to it, but more fundamentally, I think when we do a restoration, we want it to be there for a while. And so I think there is some very good work and thoughtful work from our restoration colleagues of, well, given the environment where we had an impact and we're trying to restore, on site, in kind, as much as possible, what is that environment looking like now and into the future? What is the right restoration given where it sits, given sea level rise, subsidence? If we have to do something there, can we do something there that the habitat can migrate over time? And so buying up maybe some of the uplands that are adjacent to maybe the area that we would restore initially. That's just one example that I've heard some of my colleagues talk about as being thoughtful to sea level rise, climate change matters. But the short answer is we absolutely need to take account of it. We are as best we can, but there's more work to do, and maybe with technology and thoughts from researchers and scientists, we'll get even better. But it is a hard one to tackle. I will say, and a shout out to David Charters and EPA. I know they've thought a lot about climate change, sea level rise, and what that means for remedies, and kind of bringing it back to the integrating and coordinating the remedial with the restoration. I think EPA has thought a lot about this too, and maybe there's some work that we can learn from EPA in this matter, and kind of count on that. The remediation will be effective as well, accounting for sea level rise. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony. That really does sort of lead into a question to David, and I hope he's going to be able to answer it, because I did not warn him in advance that I was going to ask him this question. So I agree with Tony. I see EPA asking all of the PRPs to think about climate change when we are choosing remedies and recommending remedies and designing remedies. And particularly if we are going to cap waste in place, or if we're going to treat waste in place for a long time, EPA insists that the remedy be durable, that it be capable of surviving a changing climate. David, I'd be really interested in hearing from you. Have you had any experience working with both PMPs and trustees to incorporate those same considerations into restoration?
Well, we don't do restoration. That's the trustees. We do remediation. And do we take climate change into account? Absolutely. We got very tired early in the process of going back to landfills underwater. This is something we now incorporate regularly in the way that Tony spoke. It's necessary we look at these things. If sea level were to rise, if we have increases in this, what are we going to do? And how can we do remediation that is appropriate on that? So we have guidance and we have policies to push the future use, the future environment that we need to look at, simply because it is reality that things are changing and we need to be constructive. If we're going to do something that a responsible party is then potentially having to redo that, there's no upside for us. We want to do it once, we want to do it well, we want to do it so the remedy perseveres. But we don't do restoration. That's what our friends in the trustees do. We will mitigate under the Clean Water Act, but trustees, responsible parties do the restoration. We don't do that. If we're doing something that might be counted as restoration, it tends to be things like, putting appropriate species back, as opposed to Kentucky bluegrass on a landfill cover. We need to reduce erosion. How can we do the best job of reducing erosion? Do we have ponds at the bottom that maybe it would be useful at effectively no additional cost to turn into, butterfly gardens or something like that? Always looking at that type of thing. But we need to take climate change into account, because it will make our engineers happy when their remedies aren't being overtaken by natural events. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I had in mind a sort of particular example of a situation where someone might combine a sediment remedy for a river with a restoration project to expand a riparian habitat around it and expand the floodplain around it, with the dual goal of cleaning up the river, restoring the resource, also creating a wider habitat for floodwater to flow in the future. If you're anticipating more extreme flood events, you solve three problems at once. And my guess is that you all know a lot more examples of that type where things can be combined. I see Steve nodding his head. Steve, do you have any examples you want to share?
I do. I can't name it, but several years ago at this same symposium that I gave an example of where we were working in a karst geographic area, where we had to do excavation of down to 20 feet in some areas to get rid of PCBs. We had 7 miles of stream, 300 acres, floodplain that was remediated. After the remediation was done, Destin, we engaged the trustees that rather than bringing everything back up to pre-existing grade, that we worked with the topography that we were given. It looked like a moonscape. And so what we were able to accomplish was to create more linear feet of stream, complex of open water and emergent wetlands that more than tenfold increased the amount of wetlands that had been there previously. And it was all done within a matter of 6 months, because the trustees and the single PRP were on board, from the first discussions on this concept. It was a wonderful project. I wish I could name it, but it was very successful.
Thanks, Steve. I have one more question on the list of questions that we circulated earlier that I really want to ask. And this one goes to Rebecca, and it is a follow-up on the framework. What can we do to keep the discussion about these opportunities to coordinate remedy and restoration going, and to share our perspectives on coordinated remedy and restoration more broadly with the trustee community, with the PRP community, and with others? I know you had some thoughts on what we might try to do, and be really interested if you would share them.
Well, just having this symposium is a great start, or it's not actually the beginning. It's just encouraging that this conversation is happening at this level. What can you all do as an ad hoc group? Is that what you're getting to, Jean?
No, actually, I was getting at what people like you could do, tribal trustees, other representatives to, I guess you could say, spread the word about
Mhm.
coordinating remedy and restoration, share advice more broadly, seek greater input.
Okay, thanks. I think just this all comes down to relationships. That's been expressed already. Respect, reciprocity, relationships, and questioning each other, and also being willing to concede on some issues that won't do the betterment of the community and the public. I think that when trustees can get involved with EPA's process from the very beginning, during the development of the RIFS, the remedial action objectives, the entire process, having the trustees involved from the beginning will really help, I think, garner the relationships to get where we're at today, seeing remedy and restoration come together. Having the trustees review designs and keeping, like the climate change component that was discussed, keeping all that in mind, because I know for at least in our case, EPA is moving forward with some remedies that we have no plans of doing any restoration in this watershed because we just don't see it ever coming back to be able to support aquatic life. And we question EPA on that. And it's a tough question because EPA usually doesn't write off a stream within a Superfund facility, but they are aware that we do not plan on going in and putting any icing on the cake. Until we can see like the water quality improve, the chemistry improve, why would we spend our limited public settlement dollars on a restoration activity where EPA is doing remedy, which they have to? So I think, spreading the word, getting the folks together, having the cross programmatic discussions between Superfund and NERDA is happening at so many different levels with tribal professional groups, with the Department of the Interior. I see Emily Joseph is on the call. We're starting to see having those conversations happening more and more. And so I think just keeping the conversation going and providing examples where we can save money, save time, utilize our local resources, our local ecological knowledge to move the needle on some of these projects. I think that's pretty much what we need to keep doing, is just keep the conversation going and try to have the practitioners in the NERDA world also be practitioners in the Superfund world, so they can wear both hats under CERCLA and be able to see where things can line up or not. So that's my recommendation. I hope that gets to what you're asking, Jean.
Yes, it absolutely does. And Jeff, I know you have some thoughts on this topic too, from the industry side. Why don't you share those?
Well, I'm not sure if it's from the industry side, it's really from the group side. I mean, folks are probably aware that this framework document is in the works. And I think it's very important. Steve's described it. And Barbara and Deb Tomasi and Ralph Stahl, and to a lesser extent me, have a manuscript in the works on the benefits of coordinating remediation and restoration. Getting that document out and circulated is important. But I think we talked a little bit in preparing for this yesterday about the value of having the framework document finalized and in a position where it can be distributed to others. I mean, it's really, I think, the group's call, Barbara's call, as to what's the most effective way to do that. That's not looking really at the big picture of how the trustees and others will get the word out that there really are benefits here to be achieved. But I think for the group that's come together here, taking that the next step forwards, making sure it's adequately publicized. Most of the firms here involved have websites that could reference it. I think making sure that the regulated community knows and the governmental community is aware and the tribal community is aware of those important documents, I think is real important. And I think the group's done a real good service focusing on this. We're pretty close to finish both the manuscript and the framework, but that's my plug for Barbara and her group.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a few minutes left for questions from the audience. Are there any questions, Paul?
You can repeat the question.
If you want to give your question, I'll repeat it into the microphone so folks can hear it online.
First, I want to thank the panel for teeing up the climate change and NRD discussion tomorrow. So we'll have a few maybe solutions to how to do it. But my question, the panel largely talked about CERCLA and Superfund and challenges remediation and NERDA. On the OPA side, on oil spills, can you comment on what the challenges are in coordinating cleanup, i.e. remediation of oil spills, and NERDA, and whether you've had more success in doing that?
Okay, let me repeat the question first. The question is a comment on the fact that we spent most of our time talking about CERCLA cleanup sites, and the question is about OPA spill sites, and was specifically directed to Tony, and asks whether we've had more success coordinating remedy and restoration in spill cases and spill responses. Tony, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I more success. I think we've had success. Obviously, different types of incidents. I think through our Office of Response and Restoration, we have a central, at least within NOAA, a centralized way of really working the response from the cleanup side, and our emergency response division that Scott mentioned earlier. They're working with Coast Guard, advising on the cleanup, thinking about resources at risk. That information is shared across our office and comes to our group in the Assessment and Restoration Division that's focused on NRDA. So I would say that is a huge success in terms of the flow of information and understanding, like right away, what's happening on the response side. And then what does that mean for NRDA in terms of, obviously we can't interfere with the response, but we can use the information from the response and, develop an NRDA if that's appropriate. So for me, that's huge, that we have an office where we have that information flow. We have the connection to the responder, Coast Guard. Not that we don't have a great relationship with EPA on waste sites, but it is a tighter relationship, at least within NOAA, to the response group, under the same small group here in NOAA. So yeah, I don't know if others see or have thoughts on kind of that what difference between spills, oil spills and hazardous waste sites. But
I want to add one comment too.
Please, Barbara.
Paul, I think the group has done work on at least a protocol, not a framework, but that's it's the predecessor, if you will, about coordinating emergency response and restoration. So we've done work on that, and in fact, this symposium has had in the past involvement from Coast Guard. We've had Thad Allen talk to us right after and one of the things that he pleaded at what year was it? 2015 we'd done too many of these symposia. He said, if I were to do it over again, I would absolutely tell people at the front of the process to start collecting data relative to the restoration and to draw those things more closely together. So we know this is absolutely on the radar screen for work that the group can maybe in 2023, that's what we do. We convene a working group specifically on that, or maybe the same working group just moves over to the emergency response restoration side, because we do have some precedent on it. And then somebody else can write a manuscript, because I think that Jeff and Ralph Stahl and I are manuscript out as a result of this restoration one that we've been working on. But anyway, excellent panel. You have definitely earned a 15-minute break, all of you. So